all countries in NATO are committed to the 2% goal. And I know these days that all are striving toward that goal. Again, partially because of Mr. Trump and his harrying of the alliance 5 years ago, but partially, I would say even more so at this point because of Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine and the danger that that aggression could extend to NATO Europe.
Do we accept, Rose, maybe we could start here, that this meeting of NATO is at a time when the world is more dangerous than it's been since the Second World War? That's a line that seems to be emerging from here, that the world is now as dangerous as it's ever been since 1945.
I don't know. I believe that's a bit of an overstatement. I think we are in a dangerous time. There is no question about it. To be honest with you, I remember the 1960s in the United States when we suffered three political assassinations, the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King. We had student protests. We had our National Guards shooting at protesters. And there was a war going on in Vietnam as well as major crises in the Middle East. So I do think that this is a difficult and dangerous time. I'm not sure it is the most difficult and dangerous since World War II. Oh, and by the way, let us not forget the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 when we came to the brink of nuclear annihilation.
Do we have the leaders, you could even compare it back to the 60s if you like, do we have the leaders now who can deal with the problems we do have?
We have very experienced leaders in place. I know there are many questions out there about Joe Biden and whether he's too old to run. I think that debate is going to have to continue to work its way out. But I will say that we have experienced leaders in most countries of the NATO alliance, and that is a good thing. And the fellow who's taking over the NATO alliance, Mark Rutte, the former prime minister of the Netherlands, served in that role for 14 years. So he's stepping into the job with a lot of knowledge and understanding of his fellow colleagues across Europe. So I do think we have a storehouse of experience, at least in the NATO alliance. But understandably, there are some difficult characters out there, and that makes it a little bit tricky.
Is this a good time for strong men to prosper? I'm very struck by whenever we have a conversation really about any place of global conflict, but you look at Russia going into Ukraine, more bombs across Ukraine yesterday, but there's Belarus, what happened in Myanmar, what's going on in the Middle East, from Iran. There's a suspicion, Rose, and you can tell me how true this is, and maybe this has always been true, that strong men feel they can prosper because although there are alliances built against them, they don't really fear those alliances because they know that we're in a period effectively where war is abhorrent to most people.
Well, we are certainly in an era of autocrats, from Xi Jinping in China to Vladimir Putin in Russia. We have Kim Jong-un in the DPRK. Yes, even in the NATO alliance, there are some who are tending in the direction of anti-democratic practices. And I speak about the president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, and the prime minister of Hungary, Mr. Orban. In addition to which, of course, we have Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, who is a very difficult case and one who has perpetrated this war in Gaza, I think, longer than needs to go on. So there's a certain whiff of strong men in the air. I think that is very true, and they seem to be challenging the world order that was put in place after World War II. I think the best way to combat that is to show the strength and effectiveness of the system that was put in place after World War II. Even the Chinese don't want to do away with the predictability, for example, of the banking and finance system that has helped them to prosper. And so Putin may say, my rules are no rules, but he hasn't come up with good options to fill the gap for the kind of prosperity and, again, predictability and peace and stability that have come in large measure since World War II.
We have a wannabe strong figure. He's not a strong man in the manner we've just been talking about. A guy called Nigel Farage in this country who was standing for one election, and one of the things he said in the course of winning his election was that NATO expansion had provoked Putin. It was on NATO and the EU, at least partially, for why there was a war in Ukraine. What do you make of that argument that NATO it has actually been a destabilizing force?
I always think those arguments are very silly, and there's one reason for that, and that is the fact that Vladimir Putin himself uh, was a friend of NATO at the beginning of this century in the early 2000s. He was the Russian president at that time and still is. But he was the one who went to Rome, signed the Rome Declaration that established the NATO Russia Council, and 14, 15 years of intensive pragmatic cooperation between NATO and Russia. And he was the guy who started that going. So if he was so worried about NATO and the role that it was playing in Europe, why did he take those steps? So I think those arguments are after the fact, and they are not borne out by the policy that Putin himself advanced in the early 2000s.
Has NATO been stung into not quite action, but a more vitality by criticism by people like Donald Trump, that actually for the last few years, maybe some countries have taken it for granted, that countries haven't spent their 2% of GDP on defense spending. America has shouldered an awful lot of the burden. Trump, who's a very destabilizing figure in many ways, maybe the next president of the United States, does appear to have landed some home truths, though, by saying, well, hang on a second, if you want the world to be safer, you need to start spending more on defense. Was that fair criticism in the end when we look back on it?
Yes, I'm smiling because I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO during Mr. Trump's first term in office. And I remember that he came like a bull through a china shop at NATO headquarters for 3 different summit meetings. And he really demanded that the allies pay up. And I have to be honest with you, my boss, Jens Stoltenberg, at the time, and still to this day, I believe, was happy that Donald Trump was pressurizing the allies in that way, because a lot of them were not living up to their commitment to spend 2% of their gross domestic product, which was a commitment they made at Wales in 2014 after Putin invaded Ukraine for the first time and took over Crimea. So from the perspective of the leadership of NATO, I felt the same way. It was actually quite useful that Trump was hassling the allies, was really telling them they needed to spend more on their own defense. And by the way, this is a bipartisan issue in the United States. Presidents since Jack Kennedy had been saying that the allies, many of them are freeloaders, they're free riding on the United States, they're not spending enough on their own defense. But it was Trump who got them to sit up and take notice for the first time. Now, I would say today we have a much different situation in that 23 out of 32 allies are paying 2% or more of their defense. They consider it a ceiling now, a floor now, rather, not a ceiling. And it is important because that is a different NATO from the one Trump saw 5 years ago. So I think if he does become president, he's going to be happy that now we have 23 allies living up to this pledge. When he was last president, there were fewer than 10 who were living up to the pledge.
Should they be out if they don't contribute? Because 2% is not, I mean, it's a lot, but many people in this country believe it should be 3% here. I know America spends more than 3%, quite a lot more than 3%. If you don't pay your 2%, why should you be in NATO? Is there an argument that Trump might come in and say he'll only support NATO if everyone pays 2%, and if they're not, they're out?
Yeah, well, there's been some talk that he would look for a 2-tier NATO system where the 2%ers get the defense of the United States in the Article 5 commitment under the Washington Treaty. That is, if they're attacked, the U.S. and the rest of the allies will come to their aid. And then, according again to reports out of the Trump camp, if a country is not paid up, they can't count on that Article 5 commitment. I frankly think that is a recipe for NATO to come apart at the seams, and all countries in NATO are committed to the 2% goal. And I know these days that all are striving toward that goal. Again, partially because of Mr. Trump and his harrying of the alliance 5 years ago, but partially, I would say even more so at this point because of Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine and the danger that aggression could extend to NATO Europe. So I do think that the allies are all moving forward to the 2% goal, and we just have to keep pressing the additional 9 allies to get it done.
Yeah, well, the threat is very visible, isn't it? Rose, so interesting to talk to you. It might not be the most dangerous time, but it still is a very dangerous time. So it's very useful to have your expertise. Thank you for joining us.
You are very welcome.